you ought to better yourself. You know, you, the other, the non-white, ought to better yourself. Now, granted, these are huge generalizations, and it's absolutely ridiculous. I know that it's ridiculous, right? But is there some legitimacy in saying, listen, me and my kind, right, are in what is perceivably a better situation than you and your kind? Why aren't you making yourself better? There is some legitimacy in that claim. There is some legitimacy. I am not saying, I don't want all the post-colonial theorists and all the, you know, I don't want all the black theorists to come at me for saying that, right? I'm not saying that it's a legitimate stance. What I am saying, though, however, is that from the perspective of, if this is the participant, right, and I, as I'm living the role of qualitative researcher, objectively, recognize, from a virtue-based, not a value-based, from a virtue-based standpoint, recognize an impartiality, a neutrality, and I'm interviewing a young white dude about his grievances against affirmative action, why wouldn't I say that there are some legitimate claims insofar he says, listen, it's not that I don't care about the plight of black people. I care about black people. I do. I care a lot about members of the African American community. It's not that I'm racist. It's not that I don't care. What it is, however, is that I can't overextend my care to allow for all of these injustices or perceived injustices inherent in the system. Now you have a debate. Now let's go back and forth. You know, is it legitimate? Is it not? Blah, blah, blah. But the point is, insofar as we talk about an ethics of care, we have to recognize this over-investment. If I over-invest in it, right, I can lose myself. And that's precisely how I lose myself. I am over-invested in the other to the point that I'm no longer concerned with myself. This is like altruism at its I don't want to go off on a tangent, but just to make it clear. Relationship with the other. Here's me, here's other. If I'm solely concerned with the other, then I lose myself, right? This is sort of altruism. And it's good, but there's some faults in altruism, right? Then you have, and I've done this in previous lectures, here's myself, here's other. I'm concerned both with myself and the other. This is moderate altruism. And then we have myself and we have the other. And then, hey, screw the other, it's all about me. This is egoism. And the sort of general account, I don't necessarily believe this, I'm just putting this out there. The general account is that this is too extreme and this is too extreme. It's more like this. I care a little bit about the other, but I also care about myself. Yes, assuming the role of a white dude, I care about members of the black community, but I also recognize that it can't be a token system where I'm as qualified as somebody else and they're getting a job and I can't. There's some legitimacy to that argument, right? I'm not saying that exhaustively, but I am saying from a rational, impartial standpoint that there is some legitimacy. So we have to recognize that this notion of care is going to be contextually based. Some individuals will function completely altruistically and give everything for the other. Some people will say, hey, you know, I care about the other dude, but I also got to make sure that, you know, my family, me and my kind, I hate those words, but are taken care of as well, right? I'm not going to give everything that I have for the other dude, though. And then some people will say, listen, I don't care anything about the other dude, it's all about me. Forget that other guy, right? So it depends on the participant. You'll have participants like this. You'll have participants like this. You'll have participants like this. It's not for you to assess the goodness, the badness, the evil, the morality of the participant and his story, and whatever manifestation that story might take, altruistic narratives, moderately altruistic narratives, egoistic narratives. It's not for you to assess that this narrative account is bad or good. It's just that it's one of these three categories. And then a recognition, insofar as we're talking about an ethics of care, well, you know, one of the perceived weaknesses of the participant, who is remaining anonymous, might be the fact that the participant never considered the plight of the other. Or it might be that the participant never considered his or her own feelings, his or her own interests. Or the case that, you know, if you wanted to frame this, I'm a bit biased, but if you want to frame this negatively, you would say, oh, maybe the participant was, you know, too naive in his or her interpretation, right? So the idea is to recognize, insofar as we're talking about a cure-based ethics approach, that it is not for us as researchers to assess the level of morality, the level of goodness with respect to the narrative accounts that we're receiving from our participants, rather than conceptually recognizing, and you are making an interpretation, it could be wrong, and I'll talk about member checking later, but, you know, based on what I'm hearing from the participant, it seems to me that the participant was motivated by self-interest, by community interest, maybe even to the extent that it was at the loss of some other community. But you can recognize, let's say, for example, and I'm a little off tangent here, but let's say in a contemporary account of the recession that we're in globally, wouldn't you think that egoism might be on the rise in a global recession? I would say yes. Some people might say no. You know, it's precisely altruism. But people might say, might it ought not to be the case that egoism is on the rise? Shouldn't we be more egoistic in a global recession? Because resources are so scarce, and resources, I'm not saying I believe this, I'm just throwing something out there to get provocative. This is to get really an account of, an understanding of what I'm teaching. But shouldn't it be the case that people ought to act more egoistically since the resources are so limited and scarce? Shouldn't you ought? Well, let me assume this as a stance and validate my findings in the world. I go to impoverished communities and I ask them about their experiences. It might be the case that I find out, no, it's precisely the case that they're more altruistic in, oh, I never thought that. I thought they'd be more interested, but they're more concerned with giving. And they don't even have to give, right? How do I make sense of that? How do I incorporate that into their lived experience, their relationship to society, to their belief systems, if they have any, to their religions, to their government, to their, you know, to their nation, to whatever. The point is, very, very good research, right? Great substance. There's a lot there to pull from, right? And not only is there a lot there to pull from, but as we've seen in previous hours of the lecture, the initial research questions are motivated, right, by moral deliberation, right? I'm deliberating morally at each point in my research about the concerns that my participant has for the lived experience and the revisiting of that lived experience, right? I'm motivated by, and I'll talk about this later, assessing and member checking to make sure that I got my participants' sort of re-story right, and the participant's interpretation of his or her own story correct. Did you mean this by this? And when you said that, did you mean that? Am I getting you right? Blah, blah, blah. And I'll talk about this later, right? So there is a sense in which this is an ongoing, continual sort of unfolding in the phenomenological sense, right? This process unfolds continuously. All right. So enough of that. Oh, that's just one half. Sorry, that's just one half. Justice is the other half. My bad. I only got through half of that. So the other half, my bad, is, and it's perfect because I can write over here. The other half is a justice-based model, right? So an autonomous self, a very formalized system, a system of rights and equalities. But then let's look at the weaknesses. And again, perceived weaknesses. Failure to be merciful. If I have, obviously you can see that this is going to be more informed by a value-based, right? A situation where the researcher might, and the participant, more importantly than the researcher, the participant has a particular value that is motivating his or her stance, right? And the conflict, the tension might arise insofar as the researcher and the participant has a failure to show any sort of remorse or mercy in the act of retelling the story. So I'll give you an example. Imagine that I was interviewing, this would be pretty interesting research, right? Qualitative research. Imagine that I was interviewing one of the guards during the whole Guantanamo detainee scandal, right? And there's accounts of abuses of authority, there's accounts of torture, dehumanization of the other, humiliation of the other, so on and so forth. We recognize immediately, based on what I've said already, that insofar as I'm interviewing this former guard, hypothetically speaking, that I ought not to, I should not, I would go so far and say I must not, as researchers